The new episode of Children of Heroes brought us to the town of Wokingham, about an hour's drive west of London, where we interviewed Mrs Anita Grosz, daughter of Flight Sergeant Hanuš Jiří Grosz.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about him?
Yes, he joined as soon as he possibly could during the war. I believe it was 1942. It says October 1942. He enlisted. He was first in the General Army, but then moved into the Air Force. He took the training and did exams. They had to do exams, and he really wanted to be a pilot. That was his ambition. He was a very proud serviceman. He had to learn the Morse code. He was he told me that he was the one that triggered the bombs dropping and things like that. So I guess he became a flight sergeant. He tried to adopt this very cavalier kind of, But he looks Czech, doesn't he? He looks very Czech to me. Here's his soldier service book. He ended up getting an award, I guess not till close to his death. He got some medals finally from the RAF, and also I think he also got the Czech award.
He came to the United Kingdom in 1939 on one of kinder transports. Is that correct?
Yeah, he came in April 1939 on one of the kinder transports that the renowned Nicky Winton had organized or helped. He's the instigator of these transports. Apparently what happened was, after the Anschluss and after all the degradation and also the November 9th and 10th pogroms, which did affect Brno, which is where he's from. He's from Brno. The family was very alerted, so they acted on it. He had already, in January, the family had gotten him a passport according to the dates on the passport, and then they went to get permission to leave the country, because that's how you had to do it. Yeah. As soon as Hitler had marched in. There were lots of names on these lists. I mean, when Nicky Winton came back to Britain in January 1939, he had over 3,000 children's names on lists that he had accumulated. The problem was how to get them over here, because there were requirements that were established by the British Home Office, and the requirements were £50 deposit, and that was for re-emigration, and £50 then is like £3,000 now. Plus, my understanding is that they were asking the Czech children, if they could, to pay for the train fare from Czechoslovakia to Britain on top of it. And then they had to find who was going to be the sponsor or the guardian, because they were children and they were coming without their parents. They got a lot of rejections, and finally my father's second cousin, Mariana Gurevich, who was an opera singing teacher, and her husband, who was a physician. They had come from Germany here in early 30s, and they refused to take them, but he found someone to sponsor them and guarantee them, and that's the only reason they were able to come over. Mm-hmm. And that was Lillian Boslein. And so she is the one, that's a picture of her from back then. She is the one who made it possible for he and his brother Carol to come over.
And did he talk about this period of his life?
Not really. He said he forgot most of it. I think he suppressed it. It was very difficult for him. He lived with survivor guilt most of his life. This is a picture of the family before the two boys left Czechoslovakia for Britain. I thought it was kind of funny that he ended up on a SS Prague. That was the ship they took. His brother was 13 and he had just turned 15. They were not schooled or placed in homes. So this was where the first placement, they had to, suddenly as city boys, they had to work as farmers. And of course, they were inappropriately dressed. They had no clue what they were doing. Their hands, I'm sure, were not toughened up. But this was a family, I think, whose son was sent to war, so they needed some labor.
He returned back to Czechoslovakia after the end of the war, but had to escape back to the UK communist school in 1948.
Yeah, so when he enlisted in the RAF, and because he was in the Czech section, then you had to demobilize in Prague. Mm-hmm. And so that's when he went back to demobilize, and he went back to look for his parents in Brno. And then he learned, of course, their demise, that they had been killed, and the family and everything was gone. And he was working as an English teacher in Brno. It alerted the communists, of course. You know, they were after the ones who had this English language and had been in Britain because they were suspect. And he was informed by his barber that they were asking about him. So he was very fortunate. So he once again had to leave the country by dropping everything. He was also acting as a reporter. He was doing articles and interviews, and he had arranged then with his connections to say he was going to interview some Czech musicians that were performing in Britain. Mm-hmm. So that's how he got out the next time. So then he came back to Britain, and of course he didn't have a job and he didn't have any wherewithal. So he and his brother, they rented a room, and they would take turns. It was a one room with one bed, a single bed, and so they would each work, and then the other one would sleep. So they switched back and forth, and he just did some sales jobs and things like that.
But finally, he studied medicine.
Yeah. So the way that happened was he was talking to another refugee. And the refugee said, yeah, when you go around the country, because he was the salesman as well, you go to the cities that have universities and you get an application and you apply. And so my father, everywhere he went, he applied to go to medical school. Now, of course, he hadn't finished he didn't finish university, he hadn't finished anything. And he got into to the university in Cardiff, so medical school. The RAF or something, there was some kind of funding that was available post-war for servicemen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how he was funded to do his studies. And so he completed his studies in Wales. And during that time, he also naturalized, became a British citizen, which was very common for Kindertransportees. I think many of them did naturalize. Mm-hmm.
And later he became a professor of psychiatry?
Yeah, so it was a complicated journey. I met my mother in Wales. She's Danish, and she was there working as a nurse in the hospital. Mm-hmm. A very shy, kind of demure woman, but I think quite attractive. And he was known as the foreigner who you have to watch out for. He's the foreigner. And they got married. They got married in Denmark. And then what happened was he got an offer for a position in Indianapolis as a research doctor. He went to New York and studied at Yeshiva University and got two advanced qualifications, one in neurology and one in psychiatry. And after he had those qualifications, he had to do it in a rush because of the visa limitations. And then he came back to Britain, and he got a job at the Maudsley, where he brought to them his work and research on, at that time it was quite novel, was group therapy and hypnosis. The university in Indiana invited him to come back as a professor and a researcher at the Psychiatric Institute. And the only problem was we went back there, but they forgot to get his housing. And we ended up, so the first month or so, we had to live in a transient hotel in downtown Indianapolis. And of course, as kids, we thought it was thrilling, but I think my parents were really shocked by it. So he became eventually a full professor, and he also went into private practice, offering hypnosis for treating smoking and weight issues for individuals. And he did a lot of work in prisons, and basically, like a lot of refugees from that period, was there to help people. The father, my grandfather, he died in Terezin, and my father didn't learn about his demise, really properly what happened till when I was a teenager. They sent this letter basically saying that, he had died and he was cremated and the ashes were thrown in the river. This is from his mother, Irma, in Birkenau, in Auschwitz, and this was created, they had to write this, postcards, and then they were gassed. So you can see that even the writing is not like her normal writing. So this was, see, I have arrived healthy. More news to follow. So they had them write that nonsense, and then they gassed them, and then later they would just send these things off. That's where he lived in Brno. And we went back there, 89 I think it was, and it was, of course, things hadn't really changed too much during that period, and he went to the door of his former apartment, and he wouldn't knock. It was so strange, but that's as close as he got. And so, that's my father with Nicky Winton. They got along well because they both had the same kind of humor. This is me with Nicky. So after Nicky's wife died, I had a young child, so I used to take him to all these places where I took her, like even little kids' music events, and stuff, because he just loved children. And after my daughter was growing up, then we used to go out we'd say, let's go out on a mystery tour. So we'd go drive out in the countryside, and then we'd pick a pub somewhere, and we'd go and have something to eat or a drink or something. And he was a lot of fun. I miss him. And so my father finally got a Czech passport shortly before he died, because he died on the 26th of September, and he got it on the 19th. But I guess it was important to him because he applied for it.
You are a member of the Kindertransport Association, is that correct?
Yes, I was one of the founding members. We formed it in 1990, so we got together in 1989. So I've been on the board since that time.
And you are doing research in this area?
Yes, so now I'm doing a PhD currently, research PhD, and looking at Kindertransportees, second generation. So that's my main interest, is really second generation. Back then, a lot of people like myself didn't know the stories, and so we were trying to figure out ways to help the children learn about their parents' experiences. And we created an oral history project where we interviewed over 100 kinder, and we would then give the tape to the family so that they could share it with their kids and grandkids and such.
You used to work as a lawyer before.
Oh yes, so that's true, yes. I started doing photography. I did some evening course with a very good photographer, and of course we developed our own work, and really it wasn't just like it is now. It was very different back then. You printed your work, and we did lots of exhibitions. And my father said that it wasn't really a job, what I was doing, and I had to do a real job if I wanted to earn some money. And so I ended up going to law school in New York. I applied for a job as a prosecutor in Brooklyn. So I was placed in the Narcotics Bureau, which was really interesting. And then I moved up to the felony level. The work was really hard work because it's, well, in New York, there's a lot of crime. And this was when crack was first coming out. So I ended up leaving that and going into private practice in intellectual property. I loved that work. That was fun. But I was up for a change, and then I met my husband, and I moved here, and things changed. And then I ended up getting a master's in fine art and photography and shifting into the arts. And then I decided I needed more intellectual stuff, so I now have gone into research.
I think we are approaching the end of our interview. Do you have anything more to add?
It's why he survived, because his parents were willing to take a risk. He took risks, and it's through chance and risk-taking that he survived. And he even survived the war in the RAF, so that's pretty good, because a lot of them didn't, so it was quite a trying time for them, but yeah.